The chandelier glittered above the dining table, casting light over silverware lined like soldiers. I had dressed carefully, navy silk pearl earrings from Ralph, wanting to feel I belonged, even if I wasn't sure anymore where. The table was crowded with Sabine's friends, people who measured life in imported cars and charity galas. Their laughter rose and fell, while I sat quietly at the far end, the knot in my stomach tightening. Dorian had greeted me stiffly, his hug perfunctory, his eyes avoiding mine. Once he had run to me with every trouble. Now he looked through me as if my presence embarrassed him. Sabine stood at the head of the table, her smile polished into a blade. She tapped her glass, then turned to me. "Marlena," she said coolly, "I think you'd feel more comfortable eating in the kitchen." The words landed like a slap. The kitchen, like a servant. I turned to Dorian, my son, but he kept his eyes down, his silence heavier than the insult. "The maid will eat in the kitchen," Sabine pressed, savoring each word. Nervous chuckles rippled around us. Others stayed silent. Humiliation burned through me, then cooled into clarity. I lifted my chin. "Fine, dear. I'll eat in the kitchen." Her smirk widened until I added steady and deliberate, "and you'll live on the street." The room froze. Forks faltered, whispers died. Sabine's smile wavered, her voice forced as she tried to laugh it off. But the shift had already happened. I ate little that night, tasting nothing. My mind was elsewhere, already moving beyond the table, beyond the cruelty toward resolve. Outside, the cold night air felt clean. As I drove away, I knew with certainty Sabine thought she had won, but she had only set the stage for what was coming. The drive home that night felt longer than it was. The road was familiar, but each mile seemed to peel back layers of memory I had buried under routine. Street lamps flickered across the windshield, illuminating fragments of my life, like photographs I hadn't asked to see. When Ralph died, I thought the hardest part of my life had already been written. 30 years of marriage, 30 years of building something together. A life, a home, a sense of belonging. He had been shrewd in business, patient in planning. I leaned on his strength, and when cancer took him, I believed I'd lost not just my husband, but the compass that kept me steady. Dorian was my anchor then, my only child, my reason to rise each morning. I poured everything into him. Money, time, prayers whispered into the darkness. I helped him through college, co-signed his first apartment lease, sent quiet checks when his paychecks fell short. He called me 3 times a week, always ending with, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you one day." I wanted to believe him. Then Sabine arrived. She breezed into his life at a real estate conference, all polish and pedigree, the daughter of a developer who measured self-worth in square footage. I knew from the first handshake she saw me not as family, but as an obstacle. Her eyes lingered on my worn coat, my modest apartment cataloging each detail, weighing me against her standards, and finding me lacking. The first Christmas after their wedding should have been joyful. Instead, it was my initiation into her quiet war. She assigned everyone a role in the family feast. Aunt Corinne would bring the roast Lionel, the wine, her own friends, elaborate desserts. When she called me, her voice syrupy, sweet, she said, "Marlena, could you bring the napkins?" Napkins. As though 30 years of raising her husband amounted to nothing more than paper to mop up spills. I remember standing in the grocery store aisle, staring at rows of decorative napkins, my throat tight. I bought the most elegant set I could find, gold-trimmed, as if that might cover the insult. At dinner, she placed them at the table with a flourish, laughing, "Look at how perfect these are." Marlena always knows her place. Everyone chuckled. Dorian sipped his wine and said nothing. That night I cried alone in my apartment, the napkin wrappers still in the trash. It didn't end there. Sabine had a talent for cruelty disguised as civility. "What a vintage coat, Marlena," she'd say, her smile polished. "You must have kept it since the '80s." Or, "It's admirable how you manage with so little space. Such resilience." To outsiders, it sounded like compliments. To me, it was death by 1,000 cuts. And slowly, Dorian changed. The boy who once defended me in the schoolyard became a man who avoided my eyes at dinners. Calls grew shorter, less frequent, until weeks passed in silence. When I visited, he looked at his watch as if kindness had a time limit. I told myself he was busy, stressed, trying to impress his wife. But deep down, I knew he was learning how to look away. What Sabine didn't know was that while she mocked my small apartment, I was making quiet moves of my own. Ralph had left more than memories. He left investments, properties he had tucked away with foresight. For years, I kept them quiet, living modestly, letting the world believe I survived on a pension. I wanted to see who loved me for me, not for the numbers on a bank statement. But love had grown thin. Respect had withered. And sitting at that dinner table tonight as Sabine called me a maid, something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I saw the years of insults lined up like dominoes, leading to this very moment. When I pulled into the driveway of my small apartment complex, I shut off the engine and sat in the dark. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady now. The humiliation I had endured was no longer a burden, but a signal. Sabine thought she had staged my downfall. She had no idea she had just set in motion her own. And for the first time in years, I felt almost grateful to her for giving me the reason to stop waiting. I drove without music, letting the white line of the road pull my thoughts into a slow, steady rhythm. The night had a way of making everything simpler. Lights reduced to smudges, voices muted to memories. In the rearview mirror, I could see the glow of the Caraway house, shrinking a little planet of guilt and gossip, receding behind me. My jaw ached from smiling. My heart felt oddly light. You'd think a woman of my age would be drifting toward resignation. Small routines, small comforts. That's what everyone expected of me, a widow content with a pension and a tidy apartment. They didn't know how I kept my hands on the levers that mattered or why I chose to live simply while the ledgers in a downtown office quietly balanced in my favor. They never asked. I preferred it that way. Marcus Ellery had been my husband, Ralph's partner, for as long as I could remember. He smelled of old paper and coffee and the kind of discretion money books teach a man. He called himself retired, but the word for people like Marcus was guardian. After Ralph passed, Marcus came to me with a careful plan and a ledger full of patience. "Keep it quiet," he said, tapping the folder on his mahogany desk like a metronome. "Watch who visits, watch who forgets." I watched. I learned. The transfers had been surgical, not spectacle. A property here, a commercial stake there, titles moved at odd hours when attention was on a gala or a sale. I used my maiden name on some documents out of habit. On others, I used shell LLCs that Ralph and Marcus had set up years ago, like seeds planted in soil I'd barely notice until it flowered. I wanted my life to be the true test who loved the woman and who loved the ledger. I wanted to see who would notice when the score changed. It was not vindictiveness that drove me. It was clarity. I had spent the last 5 years cataloging slights like a curator catalogs artifacts. The napkin incident, the cheap box of candy at Christmas, the offhand comments about vintage clothes. Each one alone could be brushed aside. Together, they had become a pattern, a social choreography meant to teach me my place. I had endured because I believed Dorian might stand between us and the storm. He did not. That had been the most bitter lesson. After the dinner, I sat in Marcus's office for an hour while he walked me through the final pages. There was a quiet ceremony to the signatures, a legalist's liturgy that made everything feel irrevocable. Timing is everything, Marcus said, as if teaching me how to speak a dialect I'd never practiced. You don't reveal the hand until you know how the room will react. I nodded. There was comfort in procedure. There was power in patience. People think planning takes only papers and pens, but the true architecture of a plan is built on silence. You practice the mannerisms. You polish the smile you'll wear when you deliver the news. You rehearse not the words, but the calm that makes words unnecessary. I had practiced my calm for months. I had practiced the way my hands would rest on the envelope containing the deed. I had practiced the tone that would make numbers sound like a verdict. When I left Marcus's office, I felt something heavier shift inside me. Not a weight, but a rearrangement. The humiliation at the table was no longer stain. It had become a signal flare, pointing to a certain truth. Actions without consequence breed contempt. I had given consequence a calendar and a signature. That night at my back door, I paused and watched the street predictable, made of the small, daily motions that people confuse with life. I could have called Dorian. I could have written a letter, shouted across the neighborhood, made the kind of scene that so many expect of a woman. My age, tears, speeches, collapse. But spectacle was Sabine's currency. I would not spend it on her. Instead, I made a list simple and practical: who to call after the deed was recorded, which confidential notices to send, and in what order. Who would be the neutral witness? Who would be the first to get the bank statements? Marcus had taught me the small choreography of scandal. Let the pincer move, appear inevitable. Let the witnesses be the ones who reveal it to the circle. Not you. It keeps the shame in other people's mouths. As I closed the door to my apartment and stacked the keys on the counter, I felt my pulse slow. The plan was in motion. The pieces were on the board. Tomorrow would be about observation, seeing who tightened, who turned pale, who called frantic allies. Tonight, though, I slept with the peculiar comfort of someone who has chosen the moment she will speak. And when morning came, the first ripple would be waiting in a place I had learned to watch the tennis courts and salons, where Sabine measured her victories by approval, and where even a rumor could detach the pillars of a life. 2 mornings after the dinner, I received a call from Margot Henley. Her voice carried that particular blend of concern and amusement women of her circle wore like perfume. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "Your daughter-in-law has been busy at the tennis club." I leaned back in my chair, tea cooling in my hand. "Busy? How she's telling anyone who'll listen that you've become difficult. That she had to put you in your place before you embarrassed yourself further. You'd think she was recounting a charity scandal, not a family dinner." Margot paused. I didn't join the chorus. I smiled into the quiet. Margot had always understood the value of silence. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet. You should see the faces of those who believed her. They don't know whether to pity you or avoid you." When I hung up, I felt no sting. Gossip had been Sabine's sport for years. She thrived on retelling events with herself in the starring role, polishing humiliation into anecdotes that bolstered her standing. But gossip was also porous. Every retelling widened the cracks. By Friday, Sabine's phone began to fill with calls she couldn't laugh away. The property management office overseeing her subdivision had reached out. Routine, they said, just updating ownership information. Her voice sharpened when she repeated this to Dorian, later clipped and strained. "It must be some bureaucratic error," she insisted. "I'll straighten it out on Monday." But errors don't come in clusters, and the letters that followed were not written in the tentative tone of a misfiled form. They carried the weight of official seals, the confidence of processes already completed. Dorian noticed. I knew he did, because he showed up at my apartment one afternoon unannounced, like he hadn't done in years. He looked tired. The lines at the corners of his eyes seemed deeper. his hair mussed as though he'd run his hands through it too many times. He stood in the doorway, holding a folder that trembled slightly in his grip. "Mom," he began, not meeting my gaze. "Do you know anything about these?" He handed me the folder. Inside were mortgage statements. Some bore notations I recognized immediately. Small, precise records Marcus had ensured would be visible to anyone who looked closely. Benefactor payments? Line items that covered more than half of each month's amount. I closed the folder gently. "And what do you think they mean?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Sabine says her parents helped us sometimes. That maybe that's what this is. But I don't know. It doesn't add up." His eyes finally met mine, then searching, almost pleading. I could have told him everything in that moment. I could have laid the truth bare and let it crash over him. Instead, I set the folder aside and poured him coffee. "You've always been good with numbers," I said. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." He frowned, but he took the cup. Silence stretched between us, thick as the steam rising from the mugs. That evening, Sabine called Margot again, this time with less triumph in her voice. Margot relayed it to me the next morning. She sounded rattled, Margot said. Tried to laugh it off, but you can hear panic when it creeps in. She said something about your name turning up in files. Then she changed the subject. I pictured Sabine, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her glass of Chardonnay. Laughter, pitched too high eyes, darting toward the corners of the room where judgment might hide. Panic never suited her. She was all polish and control. Cracks showed immediately on a surface like that. At home, I reviewed my notes, the list Marcus and I had made of the sequence to come. Property notices first, ownership confirmations next. Then the call that would summon Sabine's own allies to witness what she believed would be my downfall. She was playing directly into the rhythm we had anticipated, mistaking control for inevitability. By the time Saturday arrived, the whispers had begun to shift. Margot reported that at the club, the laughter was more restrained, the smiles tighter. They sense something, she said. They don't know what yet, but they don't believe her as easily now. That was the thing about reputations built on performance. The audience was always eager to find the first mistake. And Sabine was making them now, small slips in tone and confidence enough to tilt the balance of curiosity against her. I didn't need to hasten it. Time was doing the work for me. All I had to do was wait, watching as the cracks spread across the polished surface of her perfect life, knowing they would widen on their own until she couldn't patch them fast enough. And soon enough, she would call for the stage again, determined to reclaim control, not realizing she was setting the scene for her own unmasking. The next time Dorian came by, he didn't bother calling first. I heard his knock, quick, impatient. And when I opened the door, his eyes were already darting past me, scanning the apartment as though it might hold answers. He stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. His suit jacket hung loose on his frame, and his tie was pulled down as though he had yanked it free in frustration. He carried a folder again, and I could see the creased edges where his fingers had pressed too hard. "Mom," he said, his voice strained, "I need you to explain something to me." He laid the papers out on my small kitchen table, each sheet aligned with the next mortgage statements marked by neat black lines. His finger tapped the section labeled Benefactor Payments. "Who's been paying this?" "It says anonymous, but it's regular. Every month. It isn't my in-laws, no matter what Sabine tells me. I checked with them. They never put a cent toward this house." I kept my face still. The kettle behind me whistled softly, and I turned, lifted it from the stove, and poured boiling water over the waiting tea bags. The scent of chamomile filled the narrow kitchen. "Maybe it's an error," I said, setting a cup in front of him. He shook his head. "It's not." I called the bank. "Whoever it is, they've been covering most of the mortgage." Do you understand what that means? Without those payments, Sabine and I couldn't have kept the house. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, as though it tasted different on his tongue now. I lowered myself into the chair opposite him, folding my hands around my own cup. You've always been clever with numbers, I said. I'm sure you'll put the pieces together. His eyes narrowed. Mom, is it you? The question hung between us heavier than steam. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached across and straightened one of the papers, smoothing the crease with my fingertips. You should be careful, Dorian. Some truths can't be undone once you find them. He stared at me as if searching for a confession in the lines of my face. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the child who used to press his forehead against mine and whisper secrets no one else could know. But that boy had grown into a man who had sat silent while his wife humiliated me. That boy had learned how to look away. I don't understand, he said finally. Why wouldn't you tell me? I met his gaze. Would it have changed anything? He looked down at the papers, then away, unable to answer. He sipped the tea, though I could see his hands trembling. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking clock on the wall. Then he pushed the papers back into the folder, snapping it shut, as if the sound might hold the uncertainty inside. I need to think, he muttered. He rose, kissed my cheek absently, and left without finishing the tea. When the door closed, I sat alone at the table, staring at the empty chair. I wanted to feel triumphant, but instead, a sadness pressed at my ribs. My son had begun to suspect the truth. But suspicion is a knife with two edges it cuts as it reveals. I gathered the cups, rinsed them, and placed them back in the cabinet. Then I walked to the window, watching the taillights of his car disappear into the night. Soon enough, he would demand more than suspicion. Soon enough, he would come back not for tea, but for answers. The first call came on a Tuesday evening. Dorian's voice was careful, rehearsed, as though he'd practiced the words in front of a mirror. Mom, Sabine and I want to have another dinner. Just family this time. To talk. Openly. I could hear Sabine in the background whispering prompts like a stage director feeding lines. The image almost made me laugh. What kind of talk? I asked. About the future, he said, stumbling slightly. About what's best for everyone. Living arrangements. Things like that. I let a pause stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. You mean what's best for Sabine? There was silence, then muffled shuffling, as if the phone had changed hands. Sabine's voice came sharp and sweet. Marlena, it will be good for us to clear the air. We've invited Aunt Corinne, Cousin Lionel, a few others. People who care about this family. I think you'll appreciate having everyone present. The tribunal. She wanted witnesses and audience for my formal exile. Of course, I said evenly, I'll be there. I imagined her smile tightening, the way her eyes must have flickered at my calm. She expected tears, protest, bargaining. She always underestimated silence. That week, I heard the whispers multiply. Margot stopped by with news after her tennis match. She's telling anyone who will listen that you're stubborn, that you refuse to accept help. She says this dinner will settle things once and for all. I poured us coffee, nodding. And what do they believe? Margot's eyes softened. They believe the show at least until the curtain falls. By Thursday, invitations had spread beyond family. A neighbor told me she'd been asked to join because, as Sabine explained, Marlena listens better when respectable people are in the room. The audacity was almost breathtaking. I spent that night reviewing my folder. Documents, crisp bank transfers, neatly clipped mortgage statements in order. The deed gleamed at the top like a final act waiting for applause. Marcus had reminded me, timing is your weapon. Don't unsheath it too early. Friday evening. Dorian called again, his tone weary this time. Mom, are you sure you want to come? I mean, maybe it'll just upset you. Why wouldn't I want to come? I asked. After all, it's a dinner in my honor. He exhaled heavily, caught between guilt and loyalty, though not to me. Just don't overreact. Please. I didn't answer. I let him hear my silence until he muttered a goodbye. Saturday came with a gray sky, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. I opened my closet and laid out my black Chanel dress, the one Ralph had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I hadn't worn it in years, but the fabric still held its shape, its quiet authority. I polished the pearl earrings, fastening them with steady hands. As I looked at my reflection, I thought of Ralph's voice the day he gave me that dress. One day, he'd said, "You'll need to remind people who you are." I smiled at the memory. Tonight would be that day. When the clock struck 7, I stepped out into the evening chill, the folder tucked securely in my handbag. The street was hushed, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. I walked toward the lights of Sabine's house, glowing warm and bright against the dim sky, and knew the performance she had staged was already mine to command. The night of the second dinner arrived, with the kind of chill that seeps through fabric and into bone, though the Caraway house glowed as though it were immune to weather. Every window shone, each room lit for display, the manicured hedges trimmed to perfection. The driveway was already crowded with cars, Mercedes, Lexus, BMW, the badges. Sabine collected like trophies. Inside, the scent of roasted lamb mingled with the faint trace of lilies arranged in vases along the hall. I handed my coat to a server and stepped into the great room. The hum of conversation paused almost imperceptibly, then resumed with careful restraint. Eyes turned toward me, then away, like spectators checking to see whether the show had begun. Sabine floated toward me, a vision of curated elegance in a sapphire gown. Her smile looked effortless, but I recognized the tightness around her eyes. She kissed the air near my cheek and said just loudly enough for those nearby to hear Marlena, "How lovely you could make it tonight." I returned the smile, measured and polite. I wouldn't miss it. The dining table had been extended with both leaves long enough to seat 12. At the head, Sabine's place gleamed with extra crystal and polished silver, a subtle crown for the evening's hostess. Beside her sat Dorian, his jaw-tight hands folded too neatly in his lap. My chair was placed halfway down the table, slightly removed from the cluster of family. A gap yawned between me and Aunt Corinne, as though I were a defendant separated from the jury. The intention was clear, and Sabine's glance as I sat confirmed it. She had arranged the scene as carefully as a director blocks actors on a stage. The guests were a mix of family and carefully chosen allies. Cousin Lionel sat opposite his wife, nodding stiffly at everything Sabine said. On the other end, Margot Henley sipped her wine with the serenity of someone who already knew more than she let on. A pair of Sabine's friends from the club filled the remaining seats, whispering behind their napkins whenever Sabine shifted her posture. Dinner began with small talk, brittle and strained. Sabine carried the conversation, asking questions designed to spotlight others' successes. Lionel's new partnership, a friend's charity gala, Corinne's garden renovation. Each comment was followed by a glance in my direction, as though to underline the contrast between their accomplishments and my supposed irrelevance. The servers moved smoothly, laying dishes of lamb asparagus and potatoes au gratin in front of us. Crystal glasses caught the light, and silver chimed faintly against porcelain. The entire room shimmered with wealth and intention. Yet beneath it all lay an unease, a current no amount of polish could hide. When the plates were cleared, Sabine rose slightly in her chair, tapping her glass. The sound cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. The conversation fell silent. "Thank you all for coming tonight." She began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician. Dorian and I felt it was important to gather our closest family and friends to discuss a delicate matter, one that concerns the future of our household. My hands rested loosely in my lap. I didn't move, didn't blink. "As many of you know," Sabine continued, My dear mother-in-law has been staying involved in our lives since Ralph passed. We value her greatly, of course. She smiled down the table at me, the smile of someone presenting a reluctant student to the class. But as time goes on, we have to consider what is healthiest and most comfortable for everyone, especially Marlena. A murmur rippled through the guests. Aunt Corinne shifted in her seat. Lionel cleared his throat. Sabine pressed forward. We've found a wonderful community nearby, a place where people of her age can live surrounded by peers, with activities, medical support, and all the comforts she deserves. We truly believe it's what's best. She paused, letting the words sink in. Some nodded. Others avoided my gaze. Dorian stared at the tablecloth, his silence louder than any speech. I know change can be difficult, Sabine went on, but this is about ensuring dignity, safety, and peace for everyone. We will, of course, cover all expenses. It's the least we can do. The room was quiet, waiting for my response. I could feel the weight of their eyes pressing against me, a collective expectation that I would bow my head, murmur gratitude, play the role she had scripted. Instead, I let the silence linger, stretching thin and sharp. I lifted my glass slowly, taking a sip of water, then set it down with care. My gaze met Sabine's, calm and steady. Her smile faltered. I folded my hands neatly on the table and inclined my head slightly, as though acknowledging her effort. My voice, when it came, was soft but clear. Sabine, I do appreciate the thought you've put into this. You've arranged the evening beautifully. You've chosen witnesses carefully. A ripple of discomfort spread around the table. Sabine's eyes flickered just for a second. But before we discuss where I might live, I continued. Perhaps we should talk about where you live. The silence that followed was absolute, as though the very air had frozen. Forks clattered faintly as a server stepped back in surprise. Heads turned toward me, then toward Sabine, then back again. I smiled serene and unhurried, and watched as her composure began, just faintly, to crack. The pause stretched until it threatened to snap. Every guest sat, frozen eyes flicking between me and Sabine, as though unsure which one of us held the script. She tried to recover, first offering a brittle laugh that rang hollow against the polished crystal. I'm not sure I understand, she said, her voice pitched just a shade too high. Where I live. I reached calmly into my handbag, sliding out a thick cream envelope. The paper whispered against the tablecloth as I laid it before me. My fingers brushed the flap as though it were no more significant than a grocery list, though I could feel every gaze lock onto it. Yes, I said evenly, because the matter of where I live cannot be separated from the matter of where you live. I opened the envelope with deliberate care and drew out the first document, a bank transfer slip, crisp and undeniable. The numbers gleamed in black and white, $200,000 wired from my account to the joint account of Dorian and Sabine Caraway, dated 3 days before the closing of their house. This, I said, sliding it down the table toward Margaret Henley, who leaned forward with an eagerness she didn't bother to disguise, is a record of the down payment on your home. It didn't come from your parents, Sabine. It didn't come from Dorian's savings. It came from me. A gasp traveled the length of the table like a shiver. Lionel sat back hard in his chair. Corinne's eyes widened. Sabine's 2 friends exchanged startled glances. Even the servers paused mid-step, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Sabine blinked rapidly, lips parting and closing, but no words emerged. Dorian, on the other hand, leaned forward, his face pale, his eyes locked on the document. Mom, he whispered, as though the word were foreign. You gave us the down payment, I corrected him gently. Not gave, lent, without interest, without deadline. Because you were my son, and I wanted you to have a beginning. The paper passed from Margaret to Lionel, then to Corinne, each set of hands trembling just slightly, as if the ink might burn them. When it reached Sabine, she pushed it aside without looking. "This is absurd," she snapped, though her voice quivered. "Anyone can fabricate a bank record." Margaret's voice cut through her denial calm and deliberate. "This isn't fabricated. I know the format. My husband handled transactions like these for years. It's legitimate." All eyes turned back to Sabine. She forced a smile, though her hand gripped the stem of her wineglass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "So what? Even if it were true, it doesn't change anything. We've made every payment since then. The house is ours." I tilted my head, studying her. "Is it?" "When more than half of those payments were made from my account as well." A ripple moved through the room again, heavier this time, like the ground shifting before a quake. Dorian's head jerked toward me. "What are you talking about?" I reached back into the envelope, my fingers brushing against the next set of papers. But I didn't draw them out yet. Timing was everything Marcus had told me. Reveal one card at a time. Let the silence between revelations do the work. Instead, I folded my hands neatly on the table. "I'm talking about Foundation Dorian, about who laid it, who secured it. Because if the ground beneath your feet was never yours, then perhaps the walls you've built on top of it aren't either." He sat back slowly, eyes darting between me and Sabine. His lips parted, then pressed shut again. Sabine opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For once, her arsenal of polished phrases had failed her. The silence grew so thick I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, Lionel cleared his throat. 200,000, he muttered almost to himself. "That's no small thing." "That's the kind of thing that decides ownership." Sabine's face flushed crimson. "This is a family matter," she snapped, turning to him. "It's inappropriate to comment." But Corinne interrupted softly. "No, Sabine. It's precisely appropriate. You asked us here to witness. And now we are." The air trembled with the weight of unspoken truths. Every face at the table seemed to lean toward me, waiting for the next card, the next piece of the story that Sabine had tried so hard to keep buried. I let the silence hold just a moment longer, then placed the envelope back into my handbag, resting my palm over it. "There's more," I said, quietly, almost tenderly. "But for tonight, I think one truth is enough." The room exhaled, as though it had been holding its breath. Forks shifted, glasses clinked, but no one resumed eating. The performance Sabine had staged had slipped from her grasp, and everyone knew it. I lifted my glass of water, sipped slowly, and set it down again. Now I said softly, "Shall we continue dinner?" The table did not move. Sabine's hand shook where it gripped the stem of her glass. And in Dorian's eyes I saw the first flicker of realization that the life he believed he had built was resting on foundations he had never bothered to question. And I knew the next card would break it open even further. The clink of silverware had barely settled when I reached once more into my handbag. The envelope rustled like a living thing. I drew out the second set of documents heavier than the first and placed them on the linen tablecloth with deliberate calm. "I told you," I said softly, "that the down payment was only the beginning." Sabine stiffened her knuckles white against her wineglass. Dorian's shoulders tensed. No one else moved. I slid the stack forward, spreading the pages so the columns of numbers were visible under the chandelier's glow. "These," I continued, "are the mortgage records from the last 3 years. Every month, every payment. 2 lines, one from your account, Dorian, and one from mine." The guests leaned forward, curiosity outweighing politeness. I tapped the first page with a steady finger. "Here, 10,000 from you, and here 2,300 from me." Month after month without fail. A gasp broke from Corinne, sharp and startled. Lionel reached across the table, pulling the papers closer, scanning the columns with the intensity of a man counting cards. 65%, he whispered. She's been paying nearly 2/3. The room seemed to tilt. Chairs creaked as people shifted, murmurs rising and falling like waves. Dorian slumped back, his face, pale eyes locked on the numbers as though they might rearrange themselves into a kinder truth. His lips parted, but no words came. Sabine's reaction was different. She shook her head violently, her earrings trembling with the motion. "This is manipulation," she snapped. "These could be doctored." Sabine Lionel cut her off. His voice edged with disbelief. "The payments match the bank transfer format exactly. You can't fake a pattern like this without being caught." Margaret leaned in her calm gaze fixed on Sabine. "You invited us here to witness. Remember." "Well, we're witnessing. And what I see is 3 years of a woman being insulted in the very house she was funding." Sabine's face flushed crimson, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. The liquid inside rippled with her unsteady grip. I looked at her without malice, only clarity. "I never intended for these papers to be seen by anyone else. But since you've brought us together tonight to define my future, perhaps it's only fair that we consider who has been carrying whose weight." Dorian finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wanted to believe you'd see it for yourself," I answered. "Because I thought that when she belittled me, you would remember who kept your roof steady. But you didn't." He closed his eyes, shame rippling across his features. His fork slid from his hand and clattered onto the plate. The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Guests shifted their loyalties, tilting. Corinne avoided Sabine's gaze. Lionel leaned back, arms crossed, no longer aligned with her. Even Sabine's club friends stared down at their plates, unwilling to meet her eyes. Sabine tried again, her voice shrill. "This doesn't change anything. The deed is still in our name. We're the ones who live there." I smiled, slow and steady, for now. Her glass slipped slightly in her grip, a drop of red wine staining the white linen, like the first mark of a spreading fire. The balance in the room had shifted. I could feel it in the way the guests angled their bodies, in the way their whispers no longer favored her. The performance she had planned was gone, and in its place a reckoning she hadn't rehearsed for. I gathered the documents, neatly sliding them back into the envelope. My hand rested over it, as if sealing the truth inside. "Numbers don't bow to charm," I said quietly. "They don't bend to opinion. They speak. And when they do, the room listens." The grandfather clock in the hall struck the quarter hour, each chime resonating like punctuation to the silence that followed. I lifted my glass of water, took a measured sip, and set it down. "And if numbers are the language of ownership," I added, my eyes fixed on Sabine, "then I think it's time we discuss titles." The room seemed to draw a collective breath as I reached once more for the envelope. The envelope lay heavy in my hands, though my heart felt lighter than it had in years. I drew out the final document folded in thirds, its embossed seal catching the light like a crown. I didn't rush. Silence was the sharpest blade in a room like this. "This," I said, sliding the parchment toward the center of the table, "is the deed to the Westchester house." Sabine laughed, brittle and desperate. "We already have the deed. It's ours. This is some stunt." I unfolded the paper and smoothed it flat on the linen. Margaret Henley leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She adjusted them, scanned the lines, and let out a low, deliberate hum. "It says here," she announced, her voice steady, "that the sole owner of the property is Marlena Caldwell." Gasps shivered around the table. Corinne pressed her napkin to her lips. Lionel muttered something under his breath. Dorian's fork slipped again, clattering against porcelain. Sabine surged to her feet, chair legs screeching against the hardwood. Fraud. This is fraud. You've forged something, hired someone to fake records. You think you can humiliate me in my own home. No, I said calmly. I think I can reclaim my own home. And I have. I reached into the envelope once more and laid down a smaller sheet stamped and dated. This is a 30-day notice of eviction served to the current occupants. It is valid as of this evening. The chaos that followed was immediate. Corinne gasped audibly. Lionel sat back, stunned, shaking his head as if the world had tilted. Sabine's friends whispered furiously to each other, already distancing themselves from her. Sabine's face blazed crimson, her hands trembling as she jabbed a finger toward me. "You can't do this." "David, say something. Tell her this is insane." All eyes turned to Dorian. He sat hunched, staring at the deed as if it were a mirror showing him someone he didn't recognize. His lips moved, but no sound came. At last he whispered, "Is it true?" I met his eyes steady. "It's true." Sabine whirled on him. "Don't just sit there, fight her. This is our life, our house, everything we've built. Everything she built." I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through hers. "You built nothing but walls of contempt inside a house I made possible. Now those walls belong to me, and so does the roof over your head." Margaret folded the deed carefully, sliding it back toward me, as though returning a crown to its rightful queen. "It's authentic," she said firmly. "There is no fraud here." Sabine let out a strangled scream, half fury, half disbelief. "You can't. She can't. This is my home. It was never yours," I said. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. She swayed slightly, her perfect composure unraveling thread by thread. Dorian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The guests sat in stunned silence, witnesses to a coronation no one had expected. I gathered the deed and the eviction notice, sliding them back into the envelope. "You have 30 days, I said quietly. "Make good use of them." The clock struck the hour, its chime ringing above the chaos. And in that moment, with everyone's eyes on me, I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. The room went utterly still, waiting for what I would say next. For a moment, after I sat at the head of the table, no one moved. The chandelier hummed faintly above us, the only sound in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Then the whispers began, first from the far end, then rippling outward, until the table seemed to tremble under the weight of them. Unbelievable. She owned it all this time. Sabine lied to us, lied to everyone. Sabine's friends from the club leaned together, their polished smiles cracking as they whispered behind their hands. Lionel muttered something to his wife about misrepresentation, while Corinne pressed her palms flat against the linen, her eyes darting anywhere but toward Sabine. The fortress she had built of image and control was dissolving before her brick by brick in the gaze of those she had once commanded. I let the murmurs swell before lifting a hand. They quieted, not out of obedience, but because the air itself had shifted. "I didn't come here tonight to humiliate anyone," I said, my voice calm, carrying. "I came because Sabine chose this stage, and I will not play the part she wrote for me. I will not be cast as the burden in a story where I have been the foundation. I have endured slights, whispers, and insults at this table, but tonight I reclaim the dignity that should never have been questioned." The words settled over the guests like dust after an explosion. Some lowered their eyes. Some nodded slowly, as if only now realizing the cruelty they had tacitly approved by remaining silent for so long. Sabine slammed her palm against the table. The wineglass rattled and tipped, spilling dark liquid across the pristine linen like blood across snow. "This is madness," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You've all been manipulated. She's nothing but a bitter old woman who..." but her words drowned under the weight of the stares fixed on her. No one rushed to agree. No one laughed in solidarity. Even her closest allies turned away, unwilling to stand beside a crumbling queen. She pushed back her chair, the legs screeching against the floor, and stood trembling with fury. "You can have your house," she spat, her eyes burning into mine, "but you'll never have me out of your life. I'll never disappear quietly." I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Sabine, your absence would be the quietest gift you've ever given me." The words struck her harder than any shout. She recoiled as though slapped, then stormed out her heels, clicking like gunshots across the marble floor. The front door slammed, and with it, the last pretense of control she had fought to maintain. All that remained was Dorian. He sat hunched, staring at the tablecloth soaked with wine, his face pale and drawn. When he finally raised his eyes, they were glassy, hollow, searching. "Mom," he whispered, "why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked at him, my son, my once proud boy, who had let silence grow between us until it became a chasm. "Because I needed to know where your loyalty lived. And now I do." His face crumpled. He buried it in his hands, shoulders shaking, the sound of a man breaking under truths he could no longer escape. The guests shifted uncomfortably, gathering their coats, murmuring excuses as they rose. One by one, they left their alliances crumbling as they realized the spectacle they had been invited to had turned into a reckoning. Only Margaret lingered, placing a steady hand on my shoulder as she passed. "Well done," she murmured. When the last door closed, silence returned. The table was littered with half-eaten plates, overturned glasses, and the residue of broken pride. I stood, slowly straightened the back of my chair, and let my hand rest against the head of the table. "This room will never be the same," I said quietly. "Not for the guests, not for Sabine, but for myself." And I knew the storm of tonight was only the beginning of what would come after. The days that followed carried a strange quiet, like the stillness after a storm when the wreckage remains, but the wind has died. I filed the eviction notice through Marcus, who assured me the process was clean, airtight, unassailable. 30 days. That was the number stamped in black ink, the countdown Sabine could not erase. Word spread faster than I expected. At the club, Sabine's name shifted from admiration to ridicule. Friends who once hung on her every anecdote now whispered that she had been living on my money, clinging to a house that wasn't hers. I didn't need to ask. The reports came to me unbidden. Margot told me how Sabine arrived one morning, trying to laugh off the scandal, only to find laughter in shorter supply than she imagined. The cracks in her image had become chasms. Panic made her sloppy. She called me twice in one night, her voice shrill, demanding explanations, threatening lawyers, swearing I would regret humiliating her. I let the calls go unanswered. Marcus called the next morning, chuckling. If she had a case, she wouldn't be leaving voicemails. David's silence was harder to bear. He didn't call, didn't visit, not even to plead. I heard through Corinne that he was staying late at the office, avoiding home, until Sabine cornered him. His colleagues whispered that he seemed hollow, a man unraveling in slow motion. I wondered if he blamed me or if he blamed himself. Perhaps both. For my part, I felt neither triumph nor grief, only certainty. I woke each morning, made tea, and read in the small apartment that had been my refuge for years. The knowledge that it would soon no longer be necessary filled me with something close to peace. Detachment came easily. I had rehearsed it for years while Sabine sharpened her tongue. Each day brought some echo of the dinner. Corinne left a bouquet at my door with a note. "You were right to stand tall." Lionel called once awkwardly, apologizing for believing Sabine's stories. Even Margaret, unshaken as ever, told me over coffee. "They thought you were quiet because you were weak. They forgot that silence can also be strategy. I smiled at that. Strategy had been my armor, and now it was my weapon. The 30th day approached with the inevitability of winter. I didn't think about what would happen when Sabine packed her gowns into boxes, or when David stood in the driveway with nowhere to hide his shame. I only thought about keys and doors and the sound of silence in a house finally mine in name and presence. When Marcus handed me the official confirmation, the sheriff's department scheduled to enforce the notice if necessary, I slipped the paper into my bag with no more ceremony than paying a bill. The fortress had crumbled. The only question left was whether the man trapped inside would finally find his way out. And the answer, I knew, would come soon enough. It was a Sunday afternoon when Dorian finally came. I heard the knock, hesitant, uneven, and when I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his cheeks hollow, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. His suit hung loose as though even fabric had given up holding him. "Mom?" he whispered, almost too softly to hear. I stepped aside, and he entered as if walking into a confessional. He didn't sit until I gestured to the chair across from me. His hands shook as he unbuttoned his coat, his eyes darting from the floor to the window, but never settling on me. "I don't know where to start," he said finally, his voice raw. "I've spent weeks pretending I could fix things with work, with excuses, but I can't. I need to face it." I folded my hands, waiting. He looked up then, and his eyes were wet. "I let her treat you like that. I sat there while she humiliated you. And not just once, over and over. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that staying quiet kept the peace. But all it did was make me her accomplice." His voice cracked, and he pressed a fist to his mouth, as though to keep himself from breaking completely. "Silence is betrayal." I said, my tone firm, but not cruel. "You didn't just fail to defend me. You chose her comfort over my dignity. That was your decision." He flinched, but he didn't look away. "I know, and I hate myself for it. Every day I replay it, the napkins, the chocolates, the dinners. I see you sitting there waiting for me to speak, and I didn't. I was a coward." Tears slid down his face, and he let them. His hands gripped the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to anchor him. "I lost you," he said, his voice breaking. "And the worst part is I let it happen. She didn't force me. I let her convince me that your presence was a burden when you were the one carrying everything." For a long moment, I studied him, this man, who was still beneath the ruin, my son. "You've come here for forgiveness," I said. "But forgiveness isn't a word I hand out like a trinket. Respect must be rebuilt. Trust must be earned. Do you understand that?" He nodded quickly, desperate. "I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy time, honesty. I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I want to prove that I can be the son you raised, not the man I let myself become with her." His shoulders shook as he bent his head, the sobs muffled but relentless. I reached across the table and laid my hand lightly over his. His skin was cold, trembling, but he didn't pull away. "Dorian," I said quietly, "your father once told me that every man has to choose the kind of son he'll be, not to his parents, but to his own conscience. You've made your choice before. Now you must make it again." He lifted his head, eyes red and swollen. "Then let me start here. Let me rebuild." I didn't answer right away. I only held his gaze, searching for the boy I once knew and wondering if he was ready to rise from the wreckage he had helped create. The question of whether he could stood unspoken between us, heavy and urgent, as the clock ticked toward the days that would decide everything. The day I turned the key in the Westchester door felt nothing like conquest. There were no trumpets, no banners, just the creak of hinges and the smell of a house holding its breath. For years I had walked through this doorway as a tolerated guest, careful with my steps, as though each tile might accuse me of trespassing. This time, I crossed the threshold without hesitation. Boxes arrived in stages. I didn't bring much. Only the furniture I loved, photographs of Ralph and me, the pearl lamp that had lit my small apartment for years. I wanted the house to reflect not Sabine's ambitions nor Dorian's compromises, but my own quiet certainty. The first thing I did was strip the dining room of its heavy drapes. Sunlight flooded in, erasing the gloom that had clung to those walls like residue. I painted the living room a softer shade of cream, not the cold gray Sabine had chosen to impress her guests. I filled the bookshelves with novels I had read and reread, spines worn and familiar, and placed fresh flowers in the foyer. The house began to shift under my hands, shedding its costume of pretense and learning to breathe again. Neighbors came by at first with cautious curiosity. Some offered polite congratulations. Others lingered longer, asking questions they had been too wary to voice before. I saw in their faces the recalibration of perception, no longer the poor widow tolerated at parties, but the woman who had owned the house all along. Respect replaced pity. I didn't need their approval, but I welcomed the space it created. I walked the halls in the evening with the confidence of someone who no longer apologized for existing. The silence of the house was no longer hostile. It was companionable, a space that echoed only my own footsteps, not Sabine's sharp heels or rehearsed laughter. I took particular pleasure in reclaiming the kitchen. Where once I had been banished with napkins and dismissive smiles, I now brewed coffee each morning at the wide granite counter, sunlight spilling across bowls of fruit. I cooked for myself and for those I chose to invite. The air filled with scents of rosemary, garlic, and fresh bread, not obligation, not performance, just nourishment. One evening, I stood in the dining room again, my hand resting lightly on the back of the head chair. It was the same chair Sabine had claimed for her declarations, the same table where she had once ordered me to the kitchen. Now it was quiet, cleared of spectacle. I set one plate at the head and ate slowly, savoring not the food, but the simple fact of belonging. The house was mine openly, without disguise. No more silence meant to endure. No more waiting for permission. It wasn't victory I felt as I moved through its rooms, it was return. And as the days settled into rhythm, I realized the true reckoning would not be with plaster or deeds, but with the people who still circled my life beyond these walls. When Dorian told me he had left the Westchester house, I didn't believe him at first. He called one Sunday afternoon, his voice stripped of the smooth confidence he used to wear like armor. "I'm in my own place now," he said. "It isn't much, but it's mine." 2 days later, I saw it for myself. A modest third-floor apartment above a quiet cafe with one bedroom and a narrow balcony overlooking the street. The walls were bare, the furniture second-hand, but the space had a kind of raw honesty that surprised me. Gone were the gleaming surfaces Sabine had demanded. Here there was only the hum of simplicity. He brewed coffee in a chipped mug and handed it to me as if it were a peace offering. I accepted it, noticing his hands trembled. "I started therapy," he said, "not meeting my eyes. Twice a week. They're helping me. Untangle things? How I let her decide who I was, how I treated you. My therapist suggested I ask if you'd be willing to join a session. Just once. To talk about everything with someone who can hold the space for us." I sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but honest. "You think a stranger can undo years of silence?" "No," he admitted quickly. "But maybe they can help me listen in a way I should have all along." His words landed heavy. For years I had waited for him to speak up, to shield me, to be the man Ralph would have wanted him to be. Now at last he was offering not excuses, but effort. The first session came a week later. We sat in chairs angled slightly toward each other, a small table between us. The therapist, a woman named Ellen, began with simple questions, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Dorian, she asked. "What do you need your mother to understand?" He shifted hands, clenched on his knees. That I was weak. That I knew what Sabine was doing was wrong, but I thought staying quiet meant keeping peace. I told myself silence was neutral. But it wasn't. It was betrayal. I looked at him, at the man I had raised, now unraveling his shame, thread by thread. "Do you understand what that silence did to me?" I asked softly. He nodded, eyes wet. "It made you feel alone, like I chose her over you, and I did in ways I can never take back." His voice cracked. "I hate that I let her humiliate you while you were paying for everything. I hate that I let you sit in a room full of people who treated you like you didn't belong." I swallowed against the ache in my throat. I needed my son. Not as a financier, not as a savior, just as my son. And instead, you vanished into her shadow. Tears streaked his face. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breaking open in front of me. "I want to rebuild. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to try." Silence lingered softer this time. I thought of Ralph, of the promise I had made to protect our boy, of the years spent waiting for him to see the truth. Maybe this was the beginning. Not erasure of wounds, but the first threads of scar tissue, knitting into something sturdier. "I don't know yet what rebuilding looks like," I said finally. "But I'm willing to walk with you as long as you keep walking toward honesty." His relief came in a shuddering breath, his shoulders sagging. For the first time in years, I saw not the man molded by Sabine's cruelty, but the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the yard. When the session ended, we stepped out into the evening air together. The sky was streaked with gold, and though the street below was ordinary, the moment felt like the fragile beginning of something worth tending. Dorian walked beside me, quieter now, but steadier, and I knew the next step was mine, to take back into a life I could finally live on my own terms. 6 months later, my dining table looked nothing like the glittering spectacle Sabine once curated. The chandelier still hung above, but the light it cast fell on a smaller circle. Margot with her easy laugh, my sister Clara, leaning close with a story half-whispered, and Dorian quieter now, but present in a way I had longed for. The food was simple: roast chicken, fresh bread, a bottle of wine opened without ceremony. There was no orchestra of clinking silverware, no audience waiting to judge. Just warmth voices overlapping the hum of people who came because they wanted to, not because they needed to be seen. I watched Dorian pass the bread basket, his hand steady. Therapy had softened some of the edges in him, and though guilt still lived in his eyes, it no longer ruled them. When he caught me looking, he offered a small, tentative smile, the kind I thought I'd lost forever. Margot raised her glass. To Marlena, she said, her eyes shining, "For reminding us that respect isn't something you wait for, it's something you claim." The words settled into me like a benediction. I lifted my own glass, not with grandeur, but with quiet certainty. "To living free," I said. As we ate, I let the peace of the room wash over me. This house, once a stage for humiliation, was now my sanctuary again. The walls no longer echoed with Sabine's sharpness, but with the gentle rhythm of voices I chose to welcome. Later, when the plates were cleared and laughter lingered like the last notes of music, I walked to the window. Outside, the garden bloomed where I had planted new roses, their petals opening toward the night air. For the first time in years, the silence that followed a gathering was not heavy. It was full, alive, complete. Respect, I realized, had never been something to beg for, nor peace, something to wait on others to grant. Both were choices, boundaries, drawn and honored, even if it meant standing alone until others found the courage to stand beside you. And in that truth, I felt the inheritance Ralph would have wanted for me, not money, not titles, but freedom. that no one could take away.